All right. Welcome to the Think Podcast with Joel Sedekase, Dan Osborne, and Rafe Chenery. So I am normally the host of the Think Podcast, but over the last several weeks, my good friend and pastor Dan has been joining me on the program. And last week, Rafe, were you on twice in a single week? Or was that two separate weeks?
It was right on like a 7-day period edge. So I'm not sure how you want to count it. It was either twice in about almost 2 weeks.
Okay. All right. So now you see who's the most precise member of the tribe here. Let me tell you what, if you want something done well and done precisely, Rafe's your guy. So you'll also notice that each of our names on the stream are our Twitter handles. If you want to get in touch with us via Twitter, I think I probably use it the most. Rafe is also sharing some quality content on there, and Dan does too when he uses it, but he has apparently some sort of a life that precludes him from getting on Twitter.
In the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, like the rest of us.
That's right.
So congratulations to Dan for having a life. So today we are talking about, we're going to be discussing a subject that is known to ruffle some feathers. It's the subject of total depravity. Not exactly a feel-good topic, but what we want to do is we're going to define what total depravity is and why it's biblical and why it's true to the world. And then we're going to do something a little bit different. This is actually going to be unprecedented in Think Podcast history. We are going to bring on an actual, real, live atheist. And we are going to interview him about, what does he believe? What did he believe when he was a professing Christian? And what does he believe now? How is it different? Does he think that total depravity is a biblical doctrine? Does he think it's in line with the Bible? Does he think that it's true to the world? And we are going to bring him in. I'll introduce our atheist friend in a little bit. But for starters, how you guys doing? Dan, what's new, man?
You know what? It's kind of a rainy Wednesday for me. So I'm gearing up for a couple of things I'm teaching on coming up. So I've been spending a lot of time reading the last couple of days and have stumbled on some really interesting stuff historically going on with the Protestant Reformation, maybe some big parallels for what we're experiencing right now. So
really?
Yeah. I'm kind of jazzed about a couple ideas I'm working on with theology in the round right now. So yeah, other than that, not way too much is new with me.
Nice, man. Theology in the Round is your Facebook show that you do with a couple of other Park pastors, right?
Well, we are 4 pastors who happen to work at Park. So the important distinction there is that we do not speak on behalf of Park Community Church.
Why is that an important distinction to make, Dan?
Is that safety?
Safety, job security, things like that.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Rafe, what's going on with you, man?
I'd say similar to Dan. I'm getting knee deep into a really fun project I got going for this summer. We're launching a 10-week men's study with our men at our church. And I'm putting together 10 weeks of curriculum for it. We've called it Jesus is the Man, which is kind of a nifty little name for it. And we got a whole logo made for it and everything. We're getting t-shirts made and the whole 9 yards. So it'll be real fun. But man, just digging into developing our men, developing a pipeline for leadership, and really challenging some of the cultural false narratives of what a man is that are floating out there today that unfortunately creep into the church. And I hear them come up all the time. And so, yeah, when I start getting into biblical masculinity, my inner Dietrich Bonhoeffer starts to come out, and I can't wait to teach some guys about it. And so,
yeah.
It'll be good. That'll be happening this summer down in South Loop.
That's awesome. So for those of you watching on Facebook right now, you can see I'm putting some of your comments up on the screen. As you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment or a question. You can direct it to myself, Dan, or Rafe, or you can certainly direct it to Kenneth when he comes on, and we'll do our best to answer the comments and questions you guys have. Clean comments only, please. By the way, I had someone a couple weeks ago try to trick me into swearing in Spanish, like I didn't know, like I didn't know what it said. And so if you do that, I'm gonna have to block you. I do have a band hammer, and I'm not afraid to use it. But
Does that
other than that,
Spanish?
what's that?
Does it only apply to Spanish? Can they trick you to
I mean,
swear in other languages?
it probably, and I only know a little bit of Spanish. Maybe, you know what? I know how to say hello in Polish. So if you say, that's not really a trick, but I used to live down the street from a Polish market, and I would go in there, and but that's neither here nor there. So total depravity. Who wants to get us started? What is it, and why does it make sense? Let's start by defining it. What is total depravity?
Hey, go ahead, Rafe.
All right, well, I'll give it a stab. Total depravity is it's a doctrine of the church. And what I mean by that is you're not going to find the phrase total depravity in the Bible. So for anyone who's listening and they're like, what is this total depravity thing? It's a term that we've used, that the church has used historically to describe the condition of humanity after Adam and Eve fell in the garden. And it describes particularly our relationship to God and our moral character. And so if you're thinking about total depravity, the general idea, and I don't have a written definition in front of me or anything like that, but the general idea is that at our heart level, humanity has fallen into sin so deeply that sin is no longer just things we do, and it's not just like actions we take. Yes, those are sinful things we do, but the actual condition of our heart is that it's fallen and been corrupted so much that our actual relationship with God has been broken as a result, that our heart is fundamentally kind of like polluted and out of line with the way we were originally created to be in relationship with God. And so since our heart is wrong, that literally everything flows out of the heart. All of our sinful actions we take, all the sinful things we say and do in life, it's all flowing from the root issue of a totally depraved heart, something that's kind of fallen away from our original alignment with God. That's summary of how I would take total depravity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good articulation of it. That the piece that some people think it means is that, when we say totally depraved, we're talking about people being as bad as they possibly could be. And that's not necessarily the implication of total depravity. What it means is that every aspect of our humanity is touched and affected by the fall of Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
So I like that. I think, one of the misconceptions people definitely have is total depravity means we're all maximally sinning at all times. Do you guys think, would you say that total depravity means that we are sinning all the time apart from Christ?
To put a little language to the idea that you were just describing. So there is a phrase that's been used in the past called utter depravity.
Okay.
And utter depravity is that basically everyone is as wicked as we could possibly be. And there's kind of a split. And
that's Twitter. That's pretty much Twitter.
That's pretty much Twitter. Yeah, if you want proof of a total depravity, go to the comments section of any tweet that anyone posts of any meaning. Proof of total depravity. But the phrase utter depravity should be separated from total depravity. Utter depravity says we're all as bad as we possibly could be. And in general, the Reformed Church, the Protestant Church, has in general rejected that idea. Although I will say there's some nuances to it. The idea of total depravity is that the imago Dei, the image of God within us, has not been totally lost. And that there's actually, we're not all only wicked all the time, but actually that just we've been tainted and marred to such a degree that our relationship has been broken. So I'll come back in just a moment, but that's giving some terminology to what you were just talking about, Dan.
Dan, you like that?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, the distinction between total and utter depravity. So
okay. So John Piper, so I went into my study for this episode thinking, I'm not going to say man is always sinning all the time apart. I mean, that's pretty extreme. But John Piper, in his very Piperian way, he basically says that is exactly what we are doing. What he says is this. He says human depravity is total in at least 5 senses. So I'm getting this off of his website, desiringgod.org. Here's what he says. 1, depravity affects every human. So it's total in its scope in that regard. 2, our rebellion or hardness against God is total. That is, apart from the grace of God, there is no delight in the holiness of God, and there is no glad submission to the sovereign authority of God. 3, in his total rebellion, everything man does is sin. So there's the clincher I was just talking about. And then 4, man's inability to submit to God and do good is total, which goes along with 3. And then 5, our rebellion is totally deserving of eternal punishment. And obviously, a lot of people listening are not going to like that. The idea that we deserve total eternal punishment, hell. But what do you guys think of the idea? As Romans 8 says, it's impossible for those who are in the flesh to please God. They cannot, they do not.
Yep.
Does that mean that apart from Christ, we are that even the good things we do, and I know we're all thinking of that verse now in Jeremiah, even the good things we do are unholy before God. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think something to Rave's point early on is that when the concept of sin, even in the Bible, is one that we often relegate to one, like a specific action, or maybe we would say, it's things we ought to do that we don't do, or things that we do that we ought not to do, that kind of language. And yet, sin is a byproduct of something else. It's a byproduct of the fact that we are already born fallen. And so the problem with humanity is not necessarily sin itself. It's that we have this proclivity, because we are fallen, to do this. Another way to think about it is that we are born in rebellion against God. We are rebels. So the issue is not so much what you do. It's the fact that we are already in rebellion against God in our natural state.
There's another way to come at this. If you look at Noah and the story of Noah's Ark in the book of Genesis, we oftentimes think of the horrendous judgment that took place there. When you actually look at the real story, you're not looking at the kids' version of, the boat with the giraffes floating above the sea and everything's good. There's actually a lot of people that died in that judgment that came from God. And there's a really telling moment leading up to that story where it describes the culture of the day and why God's judgment came on it. And in the book of Genesis, it says it's something like this. It's pretty close to a quote. It says, every thought and intention of the heart was only wicked all the time. So you got to imagine a culture where total depravity had run to such a degree, and it had literally caused them to be in such a place where every thought and intention, they were only thinking wicked thoughts all the time. And then you see God's judgment come on the people of Noah's day as a result of that. And actually, it's really interesting. Abraham Kuyper, who has written, who wrote a lot of, just a lot on this topic in general. He actually, because he's looking at that and he's saying, man, every thought and intention of the heart, only wicked all the time. That doesn't seem to be the world we live in right now. And so what happened? And he actually says that God's common grace since the flood has essentially lifted up the common morality of humanity. It's kind of given an extra dose of God's common grace to all humanity so that we don't fall into a similar situation where the wicked level gets to that degree. But ultimately, our total depravity does go down to every action, kind of affirming what you said, the Piperian quote you quoted there, Joel. Yeah, and it really gets to the whole heart.
Right. That verse is Genesis 6:5. In the CSB, it says, when the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. And then it continues on. It talks about how God regretted that he had made humanity, that he had made mankind.
I mean, imagine that society.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if Chicago right now, every thought of every person, every intention of the heart was only wicked all the time? Oof.
But you would say that's not the case apart from Christ, say even ourselves before we became Christians?
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Dan.
I don't know if you could say that every thought to the fullest extent is depraved, because that would I think kind of necessarily lead into utter depravity.
Well, no, right. Not to the fullest extent, but sinful in some degree, even if it's 1% sinful or, 1% tainted. I mean, not that you could necessarily measure it that way, but are we saying that apart from regeneration, apart from being born again, a person could have any thoughts or actions that were pure, that were untainted by sin?
I think that's your key word right there, Joel, is untainted by sin. And I think the ultimate answer to that, I would agree with Piper in saying that everything we do is tainted by sin when you're outside of Christ, because frankly, your whole your model of interpreting reality is off. You can't, the Christian is able to look at a rock on the ground and know the full meaning of that rock is that rock was made to give glory to God. And the non-believer can't. Ultimately, there's an idol taking place in their life. They've replaced God with something else, whether it's themselves, and that's interpreting all of reality. And so to a degree, yes, everything is tainted by sin. At the same time, it's very important for Christians to recognize, I've been loved in very powerful ways and cared for in very, very powerful ways by non-Christians throughout my whole life. There's so many stories of incredible acts of kindness from one person to another. And so I think the language you use there is tainted, meaning our heart towards God, which is the root of sin, has pervaded everything we do. Yes.
Okay, so we're going to bring Kenneth on here in just a minute. But let's talk quickly. Is this a doctrine we see being played out in the real world? When we look at the world, do we see that the Bible's teaching on total depravity actually is true? Do we see that in the world? Or do we see, human beings are basically good? Or are we sort of morally neutral?
I'd say there is a test for that. And the test for that is, has there ever been a person that anybody can point to that has not morally failed? Because if the answer is that it's not total depravity, then certainly at some point we should be able to point to somebody and say it's really not as deep as a human condition of the heart. At some point, someone should be born that was able to do it. Now, obviously, as a Christian, we point to Jesus and say Jesus did that, and he was the one exception to this rule. But outside of Christ, we should be able to find somebody. And the real answer is, to this point in history, I don't believe anyone's ever pointed to one person and said they're without fault. So I think that's a fairly thorough litmus test for the total depravity case.
Yeah, I mean, I look at well, first of all, I look at my mug on the screen, and I don't know what's going on, but if you guys there's it's like its own little green screen. I don't know what it's doing there, but
it looks like it's showing like a different realm. Like
yes, it does.
What's behind you is not what is on the screen.
That's really weird. So if you're just listening to this podcast, you're really missing out on some crazy visual.
The Stranger Things podcast. That's
right. That's the upside down is in my mug. Yeah. I don't watch such immoral trash though. But that's cool that you guys do. So I wanted to look up some examples from the headlines from news, and sort of give them as hey, here's some examples of like total depravity. Okay. I want to just give a few examples. Some of the examples I wanted to give, I literally cannot say on this podcast because my children listen to the podcast. Okay. But I'm just going to listen to I'm just going to list a few of them. All right. The existence of abortion, the happy slapping game where teenagers go up to random strangers, slap them in the face, and try to, or also known as the knockout game, where they try to knock them down and they film it and put it on YouTube and Facebook. Poaching, racism, terrorism, Nazism, animal blood sports, the torture of political prisoners, human sacrifice by pretty much every culture up until the Christian era. The Chinese communist re-education camps. And there are many other wretched examples of just widespread depravity. Pull up Fox News, CNN, Drudge Report, pull up any website and just look at the corruption and the violence. And you might say, well, sure, those are extreme examples. But the fact is the examples are widespread throughout society, and they pervade every culture throughout history. And you might say, well, that's all well and good for them, but that doesn't apply to me. But then I would just encourage us all to look inside of our own hearts and even our own desire for self-improvement. As men, we often want to improve ourselves. There are websites and programs devoted to that. That indicates that we know that there's something wrong with us. We all know that we have sin and immorality in our own hearts that we tolerate. Even if we're not acting on it, we have the desires. Where do those desires come from? Desires that we would say that if I were to act on that desire, that would be wrong. And yet I nevertheless have the desire to do it. So there's something within us that actually desires to do things, to take actions that we would know would be wrong if we were to do it. Our constant comparison to our neighbors, whether to say, well, at least I'm not as bad as him. That's sort of a low-key backhanded way of saying, I know I'm bad. I'm not as bad as him. Our failure to live up to the biblical paradigm. Now, of course, the three of us were Christians, and really the only way to talk about this is, as Christians within the biblical framework, does the world correspond to what the biblical framework puts forward? And then what we can do is we can look at other frameworks, other worldviews and positions, and say, are those internally consistent as well? Do those correspond to the world that we see around us as well? So, Dan, any thoughts on that before we?
Yeah. One thought before we jump in. I'm sure we could continue talking and list more examples of what we see as total depravity or evidence of total depravity, and yet those are the same things that, we view those things through the lens of our anthropologic lens. It's informed by the scriptures. Obviously, if you're not starting from the place of the scriptures being true and informing your view of reality, you could look at the same events and see them as not as evidence of total depravity, but of something else. So case in point, I could look at the interaction that my two sons had this morning fighting as they're stealing their sister's doll pushcart thing. Right, they're stealing this from her, and I have to say, no one taught them how to steal, but I'm already starting from a framework that Scripture, it teaches the concept of stealing already baked into our humanity, and that they are active. They're already living in rebellion to God's law that should be written on their hearts. And so that and a lot of other examples, when Kenneth comes on here, we might point to them as evidence, and he might not see it that way. So I think that's an important piece of the conversation.
Yes. Awesome, Dan. Thanks. All right, guys. So at this point, let's go ahead and bring in our devil's advocate, who I don't think would even believe in the devil. And that is my new friend, Kenneth Leonard. And I hope he doesn't mind me calling him a friend. We've interacted a little bit on online, mostly by way of messenger. Although I feel like I know him a little bit more than that, because I'm actually preparing to debate him on May 6th, I believe, May 5th or 6th, I think May 6th. And so I've been watching some of the videos that he's been putting out and taking notes and things like that. So let's go ahead and bring in our opposing viewpoint, and that is Kenneth Leonard. Hey.
How's it going?
Hey, man.
I'm reminded of a time when Christopher Hitchens talked about entering a church, and he said he felt very, very welcome in this den of lambs. Thanks for having me.
That's good. That's
a good entrance.
And I hope our debate's on the 6th, because that's when it's marked on my calendar. So.
Okay, good. So if I show up on the 7th and I wonder where you are,
right,
I'll know you didn't chicken out.
Right.
So first of all, Ken or Kenneth, and please don't say either one.
Well, I've been called worse either way, but Ken's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Monosyllabic is good.
Okay. So Ken, your background is you are a former professing Christian. You are let's see, you are a graduate of where did you get your undergrad again? I'm sorry, I'm pulling up the
It was San Diego State. I studied English literature and neuroscience at San Diego State.
Okay. So you're definitely no slouch in the thinking department, and that's why I knew you'd be a good person to bring on here. Give us a little bit of background. You're an atheist now, but you haven't always been. True?
Right. No, I was raised in a very from my perspective, I would have said it's as hardcore a Christian family as you could have grown up in. I was talking to a friend of mine. My first concert was Carmen. I don't know if that resonates with you guys at all. I was a member of a Christian homeschool group for a number of years. Both my brother and I were homeschooled by our mom, and was very, very focused on biblical manhood. So what was being talked about earlier sort of resonated with me. But yeah, it was I didn't walk away from my faith until I was in my mid-20s. So yeah.
How did that, if you want to give us like the 30-second synopsis, the TLDR version?
Sure. Well, I'll say, I mean, that could be a whole crazy rabbit hole, but sure. The question that sort of put the initial crack in my armor was related to Calvinism, because I totally agree with Piper's analysis. And when I was thinking about if God knows who is predestined to righteousness and to redemption and who is not part of the elect, why go on creating unelected individuals? And that was the question that got me to start doing very, very serious Bible study. And over the course of a few years of reading and studying the Bible, I sort of let go of Christianity and then sort of played around with some deism and some sort of like pantheistic weird stuff before saying, no, I don't think that any of my faith-based beliefs can be sufficiently justified. And that's when I adopted atheism as a label.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
And as you hear us, I don't know if you had a chance to listen in a little bit before you.
Some.
Okay. So, and as someone who formerly subscribed to Calvinism, and I want to be theologically correct here. So, biblically speaking, and I already told you this, so I feel like I'm okay saying it now. Mm-hmm. Biblically speaking, I don't feel like I would be theologically correct to say that anyone could be a former Christian, because I don't believe that once you've been born again, you could stop being born again, right? So, right. That being said, I think it's okay to call someone a former Calvinist. I don't.
Okay.
I don't know. You guys are the pastors. Is that okay? Can I say more?
Permission granted, Joel.
So Kenneth, when it comes to total depravity, you told me earlier, you do believe that it is a biblical doctrine. You just don't think it's true.
Yeah. So I think that maybe the best way to do this would be if I just sort of take a few minutes and sort of lay out my objections, and then you guys can point out the issues there. And I want to say I haven't talked theology in a very long time, so this is a real treat for me. And like I said, I agree with Piper, but I'm sort of thinking about Calvin, right? So total depravity has its roots in the doctrine of original sin. As you guys talked about, Calvin said in Institutes of the Christian Religion that original sin is this hereditary depravity and corruption of our nature that is diffused into all parts of the soul. And he stated that all parts of the soul were possessed by sin after Adam deserted the fountain of righteousness. And I think this is important. Because in his commentary on Genesis, he held to a pretty literal reading of Genesis. So to me, it seems safe to argue that the doctrine of total depravity is built on the foundation of original sin. So with that in mind, the analogy that I would float to you guys is to imagine, some of you might not have to imagine this. Imagine you have a toddler. You bring your toddler into the kitchen and you show her some ice cream that you're putting in the freezer. And you tell the toddler, don't eat the ice cream or you're going to be punished. And then you leave the toddler with a babysitter who tells them they can totally eat the ice cream and don't worry about being punished. And when you get back, the toddler has eaten the ice cream. So as an atheist, my thought is going, what would be an appropriate response to this? And I think that telling the toddler that they and all their descendants will be punished for eating the ice cream and the stain of the ice cream will be on them forever, and that the only justification for this plan is your assertion that they should have obeyed you because you make the rules. This is problematic to me. I know that the analogy isn't perfect, but I think it opens the door to a conversation about some of the potential flaws in the narrative. And I've heard a lot of atheists ask, did Adam and Eve know what good and evil was before they ate from the tree? Were they capable of knowing the serpent was wrong to encourage them to disobey God? And is it ethical, of course, to hold people today responsible for a woman eating forbidden fruit after being told it was okay to do so by a talking serpent? So the idea found in the Bible, and you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, is that mankind exists in this natural condition apart from God. I think we're all in agreement, total rebellion because of the sins of Adam and Eve. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All men are under the power of sin. None is righteous, no, not one. Ephesians 2 makes it clear that all non-Christians are dead in trespasses and sins. But I would ask, why is this the case? And who set up the rules to this game? And I think I agree with Joel. And there's this idea, even when human beings do things that are good, which as creatures made in the image of God, it would make sense for them to be capable of doing good things. Those good actions are actually bad because they're done. I think Piper has said in service to man's rebellion, would be how you'd phrased it. And in Romans 14, Paul says, whatever's not from faith is sin. So in response to Joel's earlier question about if everything we do in a fallen state is sinful, I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. And in our fallen state, we can't even reach out to God. You guys know Romans 8, the mind is hostile to God, doesn't and cannot submit to God's law. And so according to scripture, our total depravity in light of all this is sufficient to condemn us to eternal punishment. Ephesians 2:3 says we're all children of wrath, right? And the scriptures teach that God's condemnation of unbelievers to eternal punishment is just. But I think the only way to accept this, and you touched on this earlier, is if you begin from the position that the Bible is true and that God is just, and then sort of reverse engineer your moral intuitions to fit that position. So my position would be that the doctrine of total depravity is rooted in an immoral an absurd narrative. I think that it's an attempt to convince people that they're sick, that they're saturated with sin, is how I used to put it, and that they're in need of a cure that coincidentally can only be found in the book that diagnoses them with the sickness in the first place. But in light of what we know about the origins of man and the fact that at no time were there ever only two human beings on the planet, I don't think there's any reason to accept the Eden narrative. And then I would ask, why would one adopt an allegorical reading of the text? I don't think Jesus' sacrifice makes sense in light of an allegorical reading of Genesis. And I'm putting a lot out there. I don't want to, but yeah, I think that the doctrine of total depravity strikes me as a tragic way to view humanity. I think that it's unjustified to assert that man exists in a fallen state. It's entirely grounded on one's acceptance of the Bible, which is a whole other issue we'll talk about on May 6th. But more importantly, the assumption that the world exists in a fallen state, I think, warps one's perception of the world. I think I understand the headlines that you brought up, but if you can read, Steven Pinker and Note the Decline of Violence, you can look at the proliferation of human rights and sort of the slow eradication of poverty and preventable diseases. And I don't think it makes any sense to look at the upward trajectory of humanity through the lens of total depravity. And I want to be clear, total depravity strikes me as an utterly biblical doctrine, but I don't think that it's supported by what we know about the world that we live in. I should stop. I'm rambling, but yeah, that's basically my position.
All right, who wants to jump in?
Man, I just want to say to start, totally appreciate your clarity. I feel like, and if it's true, you haven't been thinking about theology in a number of years. You're still pretty sharp.
No, it's been a while. Well, I feel like I was sound, so that soundness helps out in the present day.
You brought up a ton. I mean, you brought up a lot of launching pads to kind of start a conversation off. And there's a few things that I want to start with. Maybe one point, but actually I want to ask a real question in it. And the point is, one of the things you said at the very end is you mentioned someone who's saying, I see a lot of progress in the world. And it's interesting. And I think there's a pretty solid argument to be made. If you look back at some of those things that you listed as progress, human rights, medicine, these are things that ultimately were developed out of a Christian worldview. And so I would actually agree with you on that statement. I would agree that what we see is a progress in the world that has been being lifted up. And much of the progress that ultimately, that oftentimes is, that even you just listed right there, a lot of those things were rooted, not just invented and developed and came out of Christians thinking this way. That's one way to think of it. But actually behind that, the reason those Christians took steps to create universities, took steps to develop hospitals, took steps to create law and human rights, the reason for that was the Christian worldview that they were baked in. And so they literally were rooted out of Christianity. And so I would agree with you. A lot progress has definitely been made. But that was kind of also the promise of Jesus, right? Like there's a fallen condition of the world, and Jesus said, hey, as you go out, my kingdom will expand and justice and righteousness will flow like a river. And I think you just said exactly, you kind of just affirmed what Jesus said. That's exactly what we see taking place in history. So that's not my actual question, but I actually I'll just kind of put that out there for you to noodle on a little bit.
Well, so my thought, I guess, if I'm thinking about the sort of proliferation of the gospel, I think that the any effect that would have on the well-being of humanity is sort of secondary to the goal that people recognize that they have a need to submit to the will of God. And then I know that in Christianity, one would argue that a natural consequence of that alignment with God's Spirit would then necessarily lead to the good things that I talked about. I reject the idea that medicine and peace and the sort of positive steps that humanity has taken are rooted in a Christian worldview. And I think it's pretty easy to see that those positive steps are taken all over the world by societies that have mutually exclusive religious claims and traditions. So I think that, I don't think that there's any, and this might be sort of a radical thing to put on the table. I don't think that there's anything that the Bible can take credit for as being a unique moral teaching or a goodness that can't also be found in other places.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
I said moral good. I said a moral good. So there's love your neighbor as yourself can be found outside of Christianity. All the love your Lord your God stuff is, sort of unnecessary to the project of improving the condition of humanity, from my perspective.
From your perspective, sure,
right.
but doesn't that hit at the heart of it though, Ken? Is for you to determine which moral injunctions and proscriptions are necessary to human flourishing, you have to have an ethical and even a metaphysical starting point that's going to work its way through all of your thinking, right? So if you're saying, well, sure, love your neighbor, that's necessary. Love the Lord your God. I mean, that's really superfluous. I mean, as a Christian, I would say that's not only is that not superfluous, but that's the linchpin for all the other ethical commands. And so to just arbitrarily dismiss that, now I understand why from an atheistic perspective you would. I think you'd have to. There's no God there to love. But when we actually look at the way things played out in history, and we do look at the advancement of hospitals and universities and modern medicine and modern science, the fact of the matter, it's really historically indisputable that those were inextricably tied up to the Christian worldviews of their originators.
Well, yeah, and in societies where Christianity was sort of the only game in town when it comes to authority, then you would expect that any good that happened in a society that was sort of overseen by Christian doctrine and Christian rulers. I understand that Christianity would want to take credit for any good that was done in those societies.
Well, not just want to take credit, but you literally don't see those things arising in any other societies than the Christian one. That's kind of my point.
You don't see what things? I'm sorry.
Oh, well, the scientific revolution, for example, was arguably, a direct product of the Protestant Reformation and the natural entailments that came out of that, working its way through society. You don't see anything similar in ancient Islamic culture, ancient Chinese culture. I mean, they're working with the same resources and the same natural world around them, but you don't see anything like the scientific revolution or sure. the radical advancements that took place in Christian society in any of these other societies.
Right, and certainly the scientific revolution I mean, I'm immediately thinking of like Galileo, being told by the Pope that the church would be happy to make his findings doctrine if there could be a papal decree to sort of enforce the laws of Galileo. I think that, yeah, it makes sense if the Roman Catholic Church and then later various Protestant factions are in control of Europe, and that's where the scientific revolution is happening, then I think that this is. It's not entirely coincidental. I fully recognize and appreciate that there is a tradition in Christian thought that drove the scientific findings, but I also see the church being opposed to science at every turn, and even literacy. So I
just jump on that real quick, because I think this is an important point. The concept that I think I was trying to state is they were birthed out of a Christian worldview. And so definitely, if you look back at some of the ancient civilizations of history, there are unbelievable minds that have come up from many non-Christian cultures. I mean, you look at some of the writings and the poetry, and even just the minds, the writings that have taken place. Absolutely, there have been great minds. The reason science was developed from a Christian worldview was literally because the worldview put the pieces in place in such a way that science would be necessary. And this is actually a little bit at odds with what you were saying before. You were saying that the primary aim, that the first move of Christianity is to kind of, I don't know, I want to say convert, I guess is maybe, I don't want to summarize. That's not the word you used.
I could clarify. So, and this would speak to something that Joel said too. Is a moral action biblically, is an action moral if it benefits humanity, or is it moral if it is commanded by God?
Are you asking?
Generally. I mean, I understand that those two things can and often would overlap, right?
Yeah.
But if God commands something, is it moral regardless of whether or not it necessarily benefits humanity?
Well, so I think that I remember a time when I visited or no, this was when I was still working at Park Community Church, and I went up to Rafe and I said, Rafe, this is after we used to have all these meetings on Tuesdays, and I go up to him, I go, Rafe, I think I said something along the lines of, Rafe, I don't care what people say about you, you're a good man. You're a good man. And Rafe looks at me and goes, none is good but God, Joel. And aside from that, just being an excellent Jesus juke, a theology juke, I love
when you catch me at my best moments thinking most biblically, Joel. Thank you for supporting that.
So according to the Bible, operating out of a biblical worldview, what's good is what's in accordance with God's nature. I mean, as a former Calvinist, I know you know this. So Jesus himself said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so when God speaks, when God gives commands, he's speaking out of his good, by his definitionally good, morally good character. And so when God says something like, the heavens declare the glory of God, and he creates the whole universe for his glory. When God says, do not murder, that brings glory to God as well, but it also certainly benefits humanity. So insofar as God is giving moral commands to us, they are both in line with his good nature and in line with what's best for human flourishing. So there's no dichotomy there. It wouldn't be possible for God to give a command that wasn't good for us.
Right. And Ken, I guess the question kind of comes back.
He could give a command that isn't good for, like the Canaanites or the Amalekites, or for slaves throughout history. I mean, there's plenty of things in the Bible that.
Well, do you mean good? When you say good, do you mean pleasant? No.
I'm not talking about pleasant. So, and this is the grounding. I'm trying to nail down the grounding issue that you talked about, because it's important. Your moral grounding is in that which brings glory to God, and my moral grounding is in what is going to be beneficial in terms of maximizing human well-being and reducing human suffering.
So this is where the challenge comes. I think the challenge, personally, obviously from my bias, I think the challenge is actually on your end here, because for the Christian, you labeled it right, and Joel got it right as well when he said that there is a standard whereby we measure ethics and morality, and that's the Word of God. God declares what is good. And you brought up a couple examples which you question whether or not you feel those were good or not. And there's much to be said on those that are actually probably not what they originally sound like when you bring up something like slavery in the Bible. Very different than what most people would think of when they think of slavery. However, at the end of the day, the Christian has a straight line, right? Where we look at that line and we say, okay, we understand right and wrong based on this. And it sounds if I'm hearing you right, well, I guess let me start by saying, once you remove that and you enter into the atheist worldview, which is what you're claiming to be in, you ultimately are not left with a straight line to dictate what is right and wrong. And ultimately, it's very difficult to have a conversation of right and wrong at all. And the way you just said you'd like to measure right and wrong is by what most benefits. This is an old way. This is an old philosophy of measuring ethics, is by what brings most positive gain to a culture while minimizing the pain or minimizing the wicked that's done to a group. And
that's not what I said. I said suffering. Sorry. I said suffering. Just to be clear, some pain is useful.
Right. Most gain while some suffering. And one of the challenges with that, and one of the reasons it's an old philosophy that typically is not brought up, is because essentially under that worldview, minorities always suffer. And this is my point. This is the point I'm going to bring up. You can justify American chattel slavery underneath what you just said. We take the least amount of people suffering to bring about the most amount of economic gain for a country. And you can basically say, if that's the equation, now let's just, we've taken God out. Now let's bring in a new straight line.
Do you recognize that that's a gross misrepresentation of my position? But just before you continue, do you recognize that that's not remotely what I've suggested?
I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I think that what you've done is you brought in a new line of arbiting what is right and wrong. And I'm using that new line and saying historically, like literally philosophers have written about this a lot on that. I'm not like making that up.
Sure. I understand that.
Like books have been written on that model of thinking about how do we justify ethics. And that's actually one of the main examples that's oftentimes used, and why that model has oftentimes been abandoned is because it can justify tremendous evils to minorities.
But if what we're talking about is not reducing the conversation to a particular population group and saying, well, we can subjugate these people to elevate these other larger group of people. If what we're talking about is maximizing human well-being in a general sense, it becomes very difficult to justify something like slavery, which I would say can be simplified as just owning people as property. We're not maximizing the well-being for those people in that scenario.
So Ken, I hate to. I don't want us to get into debate mode necessarily, but I do enjoy the back and forth here. When you talk about well-being and benefit and what's beneficial, Beth Young, who, full disclosure, is a member at Dan in my church, she says, "How can we define good? We are applying our flawed and finite idea of good to God, or trying to understand God and extract what we can understand about his goodness." When we're talking about what's beneficial, you have to have a starting point that arises from your foundational principles by which you can define what's beneficial. And so, as Rafe was saying, as Christians, we can draw a straight line literally from Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, all the way straight on through to the law of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount, and even the final judgment of the reprobate in the end of the book of Revelation. So there's a straight moral line that runs all the way through. What I'm curious about is, as an atheist, how do your atheistic principles give rise to a coherent definition of what's beneficial versus, what's deleterious to human flourishing? How do you even begin to define human flourishing? And that's an honest question. That's not a gotcha.
No, I understand it is. So a few things came to mind. One is that when you talk about a moral line in the Bible, I think it's important to clarify that we're talking about moral in terms of brings glory to God, right? And that is the narrative arc of the scripture. All things being worked to the glory of God. Romans 8:28, God, we know that in all things God works together
for the good of those who love him and are
Right.
called according to his purpose.
Right.
Right.
No, I hope that was encapsulated in what I was attempting to communicate a moment ago. So, but then when we talk about atheistic principles, there's no such thing as an atheistic principle. Atheism is the answer to one question and one question only. Do I accept the proposition that a particular God or gods exist? And the answer is no. So from there, a principle, I'm sorry?
That would be a principle, though. Yes, that would be the one principle.
It's answering. I am not convinced is not a principle.
Well, the principle would be based on my criteria for judging whether or not a proposition is convincing. The God question fails that test, does not meet the criteria. That would be a principle that you have. True.
I think we might be running into. I may need you to define principle.
A proposition, a presupposition or proposition you accept, which serves as a basis for other thoughts and conclusions and reasonings that you have. I'm spitballing here, but
yeah. I don't know that I'm presupposing anything in that scenario. I guess I would be presupposing that my senses are working, but I don't know what other option I have. I would be presupposing that there are laws of logic that are intelligible to me and demonstrable. I think the demonstrable elements of the laws of logic mean that I don't know. I go back and forth about whether they're presupposed or if they're just demonstrated to work, and sort of there's like a, you have to invoke them to try to argue against them type of problem that you're running into, right? So, but with regard to atheistic principles, I don't think that that atheism gives rise to anything. So if all I've got is atheism and I've just got, I'm not convinced that there's a God. That doesn't give rise to anything ethically or morally. To think about and take on ethical questions, you have to, start digging into other wells of information.
How would it not give rise to anything? I mean, we're dealing in the world of implications. So the implication of that idea that you reject the principle that a God exists, that certainly gives license for other things to be possible, other actions to be justifiable, right?
I think that I don't see the bridge from I don't believe there's a God to therefore X. I think that anything that I would attempt to justify in my own life, any behavior that I would take on, say I want to have a pint of Ben and Jerry's later today. There's no, I'm an atheist, therefore I should or should not have a pint of Ben and Jerry's. My assessment of whether the pint of Ben and Jerry's is going to be good or bad for me has to be assessed using other criteria.
That other criteria all being informed by the first principle that you've already stated with the rejection that a God exists. And so my example would be, this is maybe a silly one, but that you could get a direct line from a God does not exist, therefore I only live once, or you only live once, right? And that's kind of the encapsulation of do what makes you happy right now in this moment.
I don't see how I don't believe there's a God could necessarily lead to I do or don't live once.
Well, any conclusion that you come to, whether it's I live once or I don't live once, or I can even ask the question about how many times I'm going to live. It has to start from that metaphysical basis, though. I mean, surely you'd agree with this. Starting from a foundation in which God is the necessarily existent basis for all of the cosmos and everything is going to lead you to a very different line of thinking than
sure it would.
Than starting from the principle of my default is atheism, or my default is a lack of belief in God, and I've yet to encounter any evidence that meets my criteria for convincing me that there is a God. I mean, there's a foundational presupposition underlying each of those, a different fundamental presupposition that is going to have, however you end up reasoning out, you really can't deny that there's going to be implications of that first assumption, can you?
I think that for every single God that I reject, there's an implication for the rejection of that God claim.
Sorry. Could you repeat that one more time?
I think that for every single God that I reject, that there's or any belief that I would reject or adopt, that there are necessary implications. So if that's all we're saying is that there are implications to atheism, especially in light of all the competing claims that are out there, then I think that I'd come with you on that. I mean, there, just like I would say there's implications to not believing in Santa Claus or it's
well, yeah. But you, as a former Calvinist, you understand the metaphysical, the vast chasm between something like believing in the tooth fairy or Santa Claus and believing that a necessarily existent God is sovereign over the cosmos. I mean, that's not really a fair comparison.
I'm just saying that the beliefs it's not. I didn't mean for it to be thought of as a comparison, but just an illustration that beliefs have consequences, regardless how silly the belief may seem. Also, I don't find anything in Calvinism about God being a necessary being necessarily.
Well, God's sovereignty would sort of be at the heart of Calvinism, and for God to be sovereign over creation indicates he has authority as the author. Creation being contingent, God would have to necessarily exist. I mean, there are all kinds of implications. I don't know if you ever encountered.
I got you. No, okay. I'm with you.
Okay. Gentlemen, it is 2 minutes until we have to wrap up. Originally, Ken was just going to come on for a few minutes, share his thoughts. We were going to interact with it. But I got to tell you what, I really enjoyed this. We've got some really good comments here. Romy says, I appreciate that atheists try to establish a moral system that works for humanity, and atheists can be very moral. So Romy and I are good friends, and I'm sure he and I will speak about that. That sounds like I'm going to take him to task. Not at all. He'll probably take me to task. He's very smart. Beth Young says, ice cream or whatever. This still asks, what is good and how can I measure good? So,
yeah, that's great. If we're gonna, I could. So
20 seconds.
Okay. So I evaluate the goodness of any given choice based on goals. So I have a goal to, I'm getting married in October. I'd like to be able to fit into my tuxedo pants. So with respect to that goal, it would not be good for me to keep pounding down pints and Ben and Jerry's. And that's an objective good. We can make objective judgments about whether our actions, about the consequences of our actions in light of our goals.
Sure, but you go back far enough, and we're not just talking about Ben and Jerry's, obviously, or even marriage. We're talking about the goodness of something like marriage. We're talking about, even marriage gets into what does it mean to be human, right? Again, you draw that straight line from Genesis 1:1 all the way through to Revelation, and you're going to hit marriage, you're going to hit divorce, you're going to hit wanting to, how you interact with your wife, and part of that is, not looking like a fat blob on your wedding night, all that stuff. So,
well, I think the other thing too there, Joel, and just a quick kind of thought on that is if you were measuring goodness on how we're achieving a goal that we've personally set, one of the challenges with that is I can get that, right? Okay, so you've put a stake in the ground. Here's my aim. Here's what I want to get, and now I can measure my actions that I'm taking, whether or not that's helping me achieve that goal. And on a one world system, I could see how that would potentially work. One of the challenges, though, is that in a world that we live in with billions of people all setting goals that are conflicting and going against each other, and some of those goals being to the harm of other people. In fact, not just some, but many of them all the time. It's very difficult to see that same logic all the way through, which is, I think, probably one of the hearts of what I was trying to get at earlier. Yeah. I think one of the challenges, and this is where this debate, I wish we had a whole nother hour to go through, because I think one of the challenges I want to talk through is, how do we determine if good is determined by personal goals? What do we do when there's two conflicting and competing personal goals? Are they both declared good, or can one ultimately be over the other? No,
I'm with you. And that's where the conversation takes place. And we could extrapolate this from the ice cream thing to marriage itself. Is marriage a good? And we can have a conversation collectively as to whether or not, as social animals, it is good for two people to pair up, and what the pros and cons are of that. And we can make assessments about whether or not that's going to be beneficial or harmful to our species. I know there are people out there who will argue that marriage is not a good thing. I disagree with them, but the conversation can happen. And I think that if we have a set of goals for humanity, that we can then make objective judgments in light of those goals.
That's Ken, because I know you a little bit, and you seem to be a guy who, from what I've seen, is I find you a likable guy, and you and I have talked about wanting to, hang out, grab a coffee or something sometime. What terrifies me about what you just said is that anyone could use those exact same words to justify literally anything. Literally anything. It all depends on who the planners are, who the goal setters are. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave that question unanswered, but, man, we got to do this again. I know I'm looking forward to our debate even more now, because hopefully we'll be able to get to hash out some of these ideas. And Ken, can I just say, thank you for being willing to come on a podcast with three Christians. And I hope you found it to be,
it's like coming home. Are you kidding me? You guys are fantastic.
Well,
thank you.
Let me tell you, man, we're all going to be praying that you really do come home. But you know what? If there's no God to listen to those prayers, you have nothing to worry about. If, on the other hand, he does exist, brace yourself, man. Just brace yourself. In all seriousness, man, this has been really, really great. Thank you so much for jumping on. Yeah. And Ken, before you go, can you tell people how can they see more of your videos, interact with more of your thoughts?
Yeah. So I've been fairly active in conversations and debates on a Facebook page called Your Friendly Neighborhood Atheist. I would encourage anyone to check it out. The guy who runs it is fantastic and just loves to sort of facilitate these types of conversations. I'm barely on Twitter, but I'm on there, and people can connect with me on Facebook. And I love having these kind of conversations, and I appreciate you guys having me.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Yep. All right, gents, we have to wrap up, but Dan, real quick, would you give us a shameless plug for your blog and your other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, you can follow what we've got going on with a page called Theology in the Round, which is a conversation designed to give viewers like a back window view into how to have important theological conversations about the world and things that are happening right now. So we've tackled communion, baptism. We're going to be talking about tomorrow at 2 p.m. We're going to be going live with a conversation of, are we in a new Reformation right now? And so I'm really excited for this topic. You can find that on Facebook, Theology in the Round. Go to my Facebook page to find links, or the Park Forest Glen Facebook page.
So does Theology in the Round have its own Facebook page now?
It does. It's not published yet because we're still building it, so it doesn't look like a janky little website.
Cool. Awesome. Rafe, how about you, man?
I would just say I'm the pastor down at Park Community Church South Loop in the South Loop neighborhood. We have, I have a blog that I maintain, rafechenery.com. And we're always doing stuff in the South Loop. So another little project of ours is called Think South Loop, which is an apologetics kind of workshop type of place. So those are the three places. rafechenery.com is where I put out a lot of my writing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning into the Think podcast. And you know what? This is not goodbye. This has just been a little pit stop along the road of your spiritual journey. Feel free to connect with the Think Institute simply by going to thethink.institute. You can connect with us on Twitter at ThinkInst, or Facebook and Instagram at The Think Institute. On Instagram, we're always sharing behind the scenes photos, beautiful, beautiful pictures of my Think Institute study, things like that. I cannot wait until quarantine is over and I can get guys back in here to have theological and philosophical discussions. You know what? As I said, this is not goodbye. I really hope that you've been able to watch our interaction today and that you've gleaned something, some kind of takeaway that's going to help you over this next week in your interactions, whether in person or digitally, with people who disagree with you, who believe differently. It's so important for us to always be ready to give a defense for the hope that we have within us, but to do so with gentleness and respect. So that's all we have for you today. Until next time, I hope it made you think.